Distinguished foreign scientist award.
Okay. So if you look at this chart, it's actually from my book, Fossils for Africa. And don't worry about the detail. All I want to show you here is that the fossil record tells us that life on Earth extends back to 3.8 billion years. And in this fantastic amount of time, we know that there were 5 major extinction events. And this is what those wavy lines, those red wavy lines are pointing to. So these are the 5 major extinction events. And at each of these events, we know that there was this huge extinction event that led to major extinctions of organisms at the time. So the one that impacted on birds was the end of the Cretaceous extinction event. So the last one that we have in the Phanerozoic. So this is the one that really we see an impact on birds. And what was the impact? Oh, I want to say that if you're interested to know more about extinctions, I have a whole 5-week course on Future Learn. It's completely free and anyone can do it. And there's currently one that's running and the next one starts on the 1st of November. So anyone's welcome to do it. But let's get back to the end of the Cretaceous. So the end of the Cretaceous extinction event happened about 65 million years ago. And we know that when this extinction event occurred, it wiped out all non-avian dinosaurs. And the only dinosaurs that survived were birds, as you can see coming off from the Saurischian lineage. And we see that the crocodiles that evolved much earlier, they also survived. But the other important thing to note is that after the end of the Cretaceous extinction event, there were many, many vacant niches that were available. And mammals experienced an explosive radiation immediately after that extinction event. And birds were fascinating because birds were around for a very long time. They evolved like about 150 million years. And we know that some birds, not all of them, but some birds crossed over that end of the Cretaceous extinction event. And we know that many others went extinct. But the fascinating thing about this is that when we look at the radiation of birds, and if you look at this chart, don't worry about reading all the details, but it may be familiar to some of you. It's the major lineages of birds. So it's the newest molecular-based phylogeny of birds. And what we see here, it was just published in 2020 in the journal Molecular Biology and Evolution. And when you look at this, you see that these numbers in black are actually divergence times. So we're using molecular dating to understand when these different groups of birds radiated. And from this, we know that the paleognates and neognates separated very, very early. So you can see that separation down here already. And other groups separated at various times. But the important thing to note is that by the Paleocene, most of the modern level taxa had evolved. And in fact, some of these divergences had already occurred before the end of the Cretaceous. So if we look at a simpler chart, so let's just take it one level down, this is even simpler. We know that these major birds that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, we know that if you look at the molecular data, it suggests that they originated, see the dotted lines, they extend right down to round about the middle of the Cretaceous, where you have the neornithines. Okay, so at this point, we think that we have the beginnings of the radiation of modern birds. But I want to point out that birds didn't just start at the neornithines, that if you look at the fossil record, there are many other birds that evolved even before modern birds. And the earliest bird that we have in the fossil record is Archaeopteryx. So when we think about birds in the fossil record, the very first indication of a bird in the fossil record was discovered in 1860, and it was just a single feather. And since then, we have 12 different specimens of Archaeopteryx. And one of the very important ones, the first one discovered was in 1861, and it was a body fossil that preserved the impressions of feathers as well as the skeleton of this very early bird. And if you look at the skeleton, I'm sure immediately some of you will notice that it has a long bony tail. And this immediately was quite striking for people because it looked like a bird. It had feathers, but it had this long bony tail. It even had teeth in its mouth. So it was very, very different. And Archaeopteryx, its name means ancient wing, dates to about 150 million years ago, so in the middle of the Jurassic. And today, it's represented by 12 specimens. And when Archaeopteryx was discovered, researchers immediately realized that this fossil was somewhere in between a reptile and a bird. It wasn't one or the other. It had a blend or a mosaic of different features. And when we look at these features, we think, to what reptile does Archaeopteryx belong? And there have been many, many different hypotheses proposed. I mean, since 1860, dinosaurs were proposed. Then we had a hypothesis of crocodiles being bird ancestors. And in 1973, this dinosaur hypothesis was revisited. And there was another proposal about a tetrapod called Proto-Avis, which now we think is actually a dinosaur, that was proposed as an ancestor of birds in the 1980s. So today we have, it's generally accepted that the closest reptiles to which birds are related are the meat-eating dinosaurs called the theropod dinosaurs. And we see many features in Archaeopteryx skeleton in terms of its skull anatomy, the structure of its forelimbs, that is the actual, not just the length of the bones, but the actual bones that make up the forelimb is like that of dinosaurs. They have the long bony tail like their dinosaurian ancestors. They have teeth in their mouth. There are some theropod dinosaurs that have feathers, and we know that Archaeopteryx certainly has feathers. And we also know that in terms of not having an ossified sternum, Archaeopteryx was also like that. In terms of its Archaeopteryx bird features, we know that the feathers are quite striking on its specimen. The actual length of the arm, so although the bones that make up the wing is like that of a dinosaur, the length of the arms are like that of birds. They have fused clavicle like birds do. In terms of the pelvic structure, it's also more like modern birds than dinosaurs. And the hind limb is very much organized the same way as modern birds are. So we see in these features, Archaeopteryx has this blend of features between these meat-eating dinosaurs and birds. And if we put all this different information together and we try to develop or do a cladistic analysis of dinosaurs, so here I circle dinosaurs, as part of the archosaurs, which are diapsids, which are amniotes, which are tetrapods, if we put Dinosauria here and try to see how do birds actually fit into this cladogram, we understand that birds, here in gray, birds actually are related to dinosaurs, but they actually are very derived dinosaurs. And in many features, at each of these nodes, we can see the development of different characteristics. So at each of these nodes, we can see there are different characteristics that develop. And here, the focus is just simply on the kinds of feathers that develop. Here you can see the wishbone, the presence of vein feathers. And as you get closer and closer to modern birds, you begin to see the features that we find in modern birds. So the pennaceous feathers, the pygostyle, which is the fused tailbone, develops. And these features we begin to see develop in the more and more derived birds. And finally, you'll see modern bird features in the neornithines. So this can be tracked in the evolutionary history via the anatomy of these different animals. So if you look at this chart, you'll see that here you have a very basal dinosaur, which we call Coelophysis. And on the other end, we have a modern bird. And all of these are pelvic girdles of different dinosaurs. And then you see Archaeopteryx and then modern birds. And we see that there are changes that occur in these different dinosaurs. And as they come closer to birds, their morphology also changes and they take on more the appearance of the bird-like form. And in the second row, we see that how the wrist and hand of birds develop. And as you all know, the birds, modern birds, have this very reduced hand. The digits are mostly fused. But when you look at where and how these actually could have developed, you can actually follow it in the dinosaurs themselves, because even the derived dinosaurs begin to show these reduced digits and fusion in their hands as well. And the same applies to the clavicles, that in the early dinosaurs, you see these unfused clavicles. But as we look at more derived dinosaurs, where the clavicle becomes an important part of the flight mechanism as well, we see that the fused clavicle is also present. So these anatomical features can be tracked within these different dinosaurs. And one of the things that is very clear these days is that birds right here, aves, actually are part of the derived clade of dinosaurs called the Meniraptoran dinosaurs. Okay, so this is really like the crown group radiation of dinosaurs. They're really very, very derived dinosaurs. And the other interesting thing about this here, right at the top, I circled Archaeopteryx. And right at the bottom, here we have the neornithines. So this is modern birds, and that is Archaeopteryx. And all of these different birds here are all fossilized birds that are not modern birds. So only this bottom, this little corner here at the bottom are the modern birds. Everything else here is actually fossilized birds. Most of them are from the Mesozoic, and when we look at them, you see that there are many of them that show wonderful adaptations for different kind of lifestyles. So they were terrestrial forms, they were diving forms, they were ones that were completely aerial, they were able to fly. And we see this wonderful radiation of birds. And even in this early radiation, many of them actually have wonderful adaptations for different lifestyles. So that I think is quite fascinating. And the strangest thing is that when we look at the evolution of birds, and when we look at the end of the Cretaceous, we know that all these other birds went extinct. Only members of the neornithines actually survive. Everything else go extinct. And so this is really quite an important feature in the evolutionary history of birds. And many researchers are trying to understand what makes these early birds different from modern birds. And there's some indications now that it may be something to do with the structure of their brains, but there's still lots of gaps in our understanding. We're still not 100% clear about why these different birds didn't actually survive. So when we talk about the evolution of birds, it's very difficult to separate flight from the evolution of birds. And we know that for a long time, there were two main hypotheses. There was the trees downwards hypothesis for the origin of flight, and there was the ground upward hypothesis. And the first one, of course, suggests that, these bird-like animals would climb onto trees, and once they reach a height, they would try to glide off. And the other one suggested that birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs that were ground living, and that they basically developed flight from the ground upwards. But what we know today is that this picture is so much more complicated. And it's complicated because in 1994, we had a dinosaur that was discovered that had feathers. And this was the very first dinosaur with feathers. It's called Sinosauropteryx. And it basically challenged all the previous ideas about origins of birds from other kinds of reptiles. And it seemed to clinch this idea that dinosaurs and birds are much more closely related than anybody had ever thought before. And the fascinating thing about this is that when we look at the evolution of feathers, we see that there are many different kinds of feathers. This is another feathered dinosaur from China. It's under ultraviolet light, and you can see these gastroliths in its stomach. So it uses these stones to help digestion. And under ultraviolet light, you see very clearly the feather-like integument that is preserved in these specimens. So you have beautiful anatomical preservation, and you also have the feathers that are preserved. And a few years later, in 2003, another discovery was made. And this time it was a feathered dinosaur, but this time the feathers were both on the forelimbs and on the hind limbs. So we had the evolution of four-winged dinosaurs. And here you see birds on this end of the spectrum. So the fascinating thing about this is that among the theropod dinosaurs, the very derived forms were beginning to kind of have a selection for flight. There seemed to have been some kind of drive for an aerial lifestyle. And we see these four-winged dinosaurs. We see this whole development of Archaeopteryx and the other range of different birds that I told you about. And the fascinating thing about this particular individual, the Microraptor, is that when people were talking about the origin of flight, a very early hypothesis suggested, oops, sorry, my phone is beeping. Oops. Sorry, I have to put this off, sorry. Oops, sorry, it wasn't, I had put my phone on silent, but it's my son actually calling, and I think it comes through irrespective of whether you block it, but nevertheless. Anyway, so here we have this four-winged dinosaur called Microraptor, and Beebe in 1915 had already proposed a hypothesis for a four-wing stage in the evolution of flight. And it was quite fascinating that, he had proposed this hypothesis without any evidence. And here we had in 2003, this wonderful fossil that was discovered. And we were all quite stunned because, I mean, how on earth would this animal have flown? How did it use its forelimbs? How did it use its hind limbs? And what's even more interesting is that the feathers that are present on Microraptor are exactly like modern bird feathers. So they are very derived feathers. And then in 2014, I had this wonderful good fortune of working on a four-winged dinosaur myself from Liaoning in China. And this was a dinosaur that we named Changuraptor. And the interesting thing about this animal, it is one of the largest Microraptorid that is known. So there are only 7 that are known, but it's the largest. And it has this incredibly long tail feathers, and the longest one of the tail feathers are about 30 centimeters. So it's really quite an astounding animal. We're not even sure how it functioned yet. I have colleagues from engineering actually who are trying to understand its locomotory capabilities, but so far we haven't even published anything on this yet. But it's really quite fascinating to think how this animal would have used this long tail and equipped with feathers, and also how it would have functioned in flight as well. There have even been some wonderful discoveries of birds in ember, and there's this discovery of a hatchling early bird called an enantiornithine that was found in 99-million-year-old ember, and the preservation is just absolutely exquisite. So when you look at all these different kinds of feathered dinosaurs and early birds, we know that there are many different kinds of feathers. So when we look at modern birds, we see down feathers, and we see other kinds of feathers on the wings. And we know that there are at least 2 major types that we can recognize among modern birds. But in the fossil record, we see that there are different types, and types that are not even present any longer. So some of these very early dinosaurs that are far away from birds, some of these dinosaurs that are really quite far from birds. So here you have basal birds, and these basal dinosaurs, like ornithischian dinosaurs that are far from the origin of birds, they have feathers, but their feathers are very different. They are what we call feather-like structures. They're more like fibrous kind of structures and filamentous kind of structures. And you can see these question marks next to these more basal taxa that suggest that we're not really 100% sure what kind of integument these are. But as you go up closer to the origin of birds, you see that you're beginning to get these feather-like structures that are clearly more bird-like. And then there isn't any doubt that we're dealing with feathers that are exactly like modern birds. So by the time you come to the many Raptoran dinosaurs and we look at these more derived dinosaurs, we begin to see the pennaceous feathers that we find in modern birds today. So right up here, so look, there's modern birds, and here at this node, we begin to see these kind of feathers developing. And then, as is typical in paleontology, just when we think we understand something about the evolution of flight, something else is discovered. And this wonderful specimen called Embopteryx was described in 2019, just the other day. And it has membranous wings, would you believe, like a bat, and it has feather-like integument. So this is a curveball that nobody expected. And what is even interesting, or more interesting, I should say, here's a reconstruction of how Embopteryx looks, is that there are now at least 4 specimens of these dinosaurs with membranous wings and feather-like structures. And they are called the Censoropterigidae. Okay, so they are a very special group of dinosaurs. And lo and behold, when we put them in a cladistic analysis, they come out as the closest relatives to birds. So for all you bird lovers out there, you have to remember this incredibly difficult name, but it's worth remembering because they are the closest dinosaurs to birds. And so the Censoropterigidae are these dinosaurs with membranous wings and feather-like structures, and they're the closest dinosaurs to birds. Okay, so we know that they themselves are nested within the Maniraptora. So remember early on I told you about this particular group, the Maniraptora, and the Maniraptora has many other derived dinosaurs, and maybe some of you will know the Dromaeosaurids. They're also very well-known dinosaurs. But until recently, we thought that these were the closest dinosaurs to birds, but now we know that it's these Censoropterigidae that are closest to modern birds. And then when we look at these early birds and their dinosaurian relatives, the par-aves, that whole group that's framed in that square, we see that flight evolved not once, but multiple times. So when we think about flight, most of us think about birds, and we think about, of course, certainly bats, but since we're talking about birds, we know that the four-limb flight is only one kind of mechanism of flight. And this cladogram here, everything that you see in green highlights dinosaurs that have the capability for flight. So in terms of the lengthening of their limbs or the presence of feathers or these aerofoil structures that they could have used for flight, like these membranous wings, we see that every one of these derived groups, so just to again give you some context, this is all in the very derived dinosaurs, in the par-aves, that is the dinosaurs that are closest to birds and birds themselves. And here we see birds, aviale is here. So all of these in green tells us that there were many different types of flight, and flight is not unique to birds. And the question then becomes, so why? Why did these derived dinosaurs actually take to the air? And, you know, there's no clear answer for this. Many researchers think that perhaps it has to do with a new niche. It's a niche where the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, occupied the air. But at the very latest Cretaceous, it may be that there was more availability for these dinosaurs to evolve. And then within these fossil feathers, there are now discoveries that actually can give us information about the color of these dinosaurs. And so within the feathers, there are these organelles called melanosomes that contain pigment. And the different pigment tells us about the color of those particular feathers. So if you have eumelanin in these little cylindrical little organelles, then you can understand that that feather would have been black or gray. And if you have these more spherical melanosomes, they tend to have phenylalanine in them, and they give the color, the reddish browns and yellow colors. So you now have a way to work out the coloration of different dinosaurs. And Sinosauropteryx was the first feathered dinosaur that was discovered, and just fittingly, it was also the first feathered dinosaur that people actually worked out the true coloration of this dinosaur. And so by analyzing the different feathers all along the body of this animal, these researchers were able to identify how this dinosaur was colored. So this is actually not an artist's imagination. This is actually a real reconstruction of what the color of this dinosaur was. And just like that, there have been many others that have been analyzed. I thought I'll tell you about Enchionus, which is very, very close to the origin of birds. And its color reconstruction suggested that it was basically black and white colored, and it had this crown of red. So very striking, really quite something. And then this brings me to the final section that I want to talk to you about, which is my own research, which involves the analysis of the bone microstructure. And what you're looking at here is a section through a dinosaur bone. The section is 180 million years. And the really cool thing about this is that you can actually understand exactly the kind of bone tissue that was present in this dinosaur. So these big blotches, these dark blotches, they indicate to us how the blood vessels would course through the bone of this dinosaur. These tiny black specks, they actually are the spaces in which the cells of the bone would be would sit. So this is where the osteocytes would be located. And the different color that you see, it tells us about the organization of the collagen within this very, very early dinosaur bone tissue. So this is from 180 million years. So it's not even close to a bird yet, but this is really very, very clearly, one can see these different tissue structures. And if you really are interested, I have my book called The Microstructure of Dinosaur Bone. It was published in 2005. And it basically explains how we can use the microstructure to try and understand the rate at which bones form, or what age an animal is, or how did an animal grow. And there's a huge number of paleobiological deductions that can be made from bone. And this is where I actually, I should say, this is how I do my research and how I'm able to contribute to paleobiology. And I've worked on many different early birds, actually more than 10, I think altogether, maybe probably like 14 different early birds that I've worked on. And today I thought I'll quickly tell you about Confuciusornis, which was an early Cretaceous bird. You can see it's circled over here. And Archaeopteryx, remember, is here. So this is Confuciusornis here. It's what we call a basal bird, and it dates to about 124 million years ago. It's from northeastern China. And one of the fascinating things about Confuciusornis, unlike most other birds, it is known by thousands of individuals. So there was some kind of catastrophic mortality that occurred where thousands of these birds died. And it's known by both the skeleton as well as the feathers. So we have really good plumage of these birds that have been known. And the other important thing about Confuciusornis is that it is the oldest bird with a beak. So remember I told you Archaeopteryx had teeth in its jaws, and as you get more and more closer to birds, you see that you get the bird-like features, and Confuciusornis is one of those birds where it has a clear beak. And the other interesting thing about Confuciusornis is that when the fossils were found, there seemed to be very clearly two morphs. So one with long tail feathers, which everybody thought these are like we know today, the males of the species with the ornamental feathers, and the one without the tail feathers were female. But of course, as is typical in science, there's a lot of skepticism, and people said maybe they are just different types of birds. And anyway, when I began working on Confuciusornis, the aim of my research was to look at the development and the growth of these birds. And when I began looking at the bone tissues, I actually came across some tissue that actually was quite different. And I realized that what I was looking at was a bone tissue that we call medullary bone. And when we look at modern birds, we know that when just before they start to lay eggs, they develop very special tissue inside the marrow cavity of their bones. So here you see, this will be the bone wall, and inside the marrow cavity, they have this kind of tissue that develops. And what I found is that within one of the individuals of Confuciusornis, there was clearly the bone wall. So this is the bone wall. And at a higher magnification, you can see the inside of the bone wall. And then here's an even higher magnification where you can see these bony tissue growths that actually are very similar to this situation. And so we've then postulated that what we have here is these forms are the females of Confuciusornis, and these are the males. So this was really quite fascinating, because when we began to now study more of these birds, we were able to look at males and females. And when we tried to understand something about their growth, we also then could say we could say something about how males grow and how females grow. And one of the interesting things that we discovered is that there seems to be a huge amount of plasticity as to when they reach a mature body size. So if we look at this, we see that there were some really large birds, but some of them were only about 3 years old, whereas a bird that was about 5 years old was actually substantially smaller. And so this gave us an idea that there was a huge amount of plasticity in the development of these birds. And when we look at the different kinds of tissue, so don't worry about these different labels, they just indicate different kinds of bony tissue. One of the things that is quite striking is that among the early birds, we can see many different kinds of bone tissue. But it's only in Confuciusornis that we have the same range and diversity of tissues as we get in modern birds. And so that is quite interesting. So Confuciusornis is one of those iconic birds because it has all these perplexing attributes to it. And it also suggests that it grew like modern birds. And one of the features that we find in its bone is that it took about 5 years for those individuals to reach maximum body size. So to sum up, we basically can say that birds are many reptoran dinosaurs. And we know that the evolution of flight and the origin of birds are completely decoupled. Okay, so if we look at the evolution of birds and when flight originates, it's decoupled. They're not directly linked. And when we look at the many reptoran dinosaurs, we see that flight evolved many different times, that there were different ways in which these dinosaurs could fly. Some of them had 4 limbs with feathered wings, like modern birds. Some of them had 4 limbs and hind limbs that were feathered, and some of them had 4 limbs that had membranous wings. So these are really very interesting developments about birds, and it allows us a much deeper appreciation about the evolution of birds. But of course, as you all know now, not all dinosaurs are extinct, and the conservation of birds is in our hands. Again, there's a little cartoon. And I just want to end off to say that, I have a whole variety of different kinds of books that are available. This particular one, Dinosaurs and Other Prehistoric Life, is going to be out on Friday. So the 16th of September, this book is going to be released. And this book, Dinosaurs of Africa, was released in May this year. So these are definitely, if you're interested in fossils, if you know kids that are interested, they would certainly love these books. Thank you. Thank you, Linda.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Now, where am I? I just want to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
No sound?
Okay, so thank you so very, very much indeed. That was just amazing. And it certainly recalls for me the first time that I heard the connection between early dinosaurs and Archaeopteryx, in fact, was the first talk I ever heard. And this was even more exciting, the fact that we could even come up with the colors of those feathers and understand what the creature looked like is just mind-blowing for me. So thank you for bringing us into your world and into the world of those amazing creatures that, were the forerunners of what we love to watch today. So I wonder whether anybody's got any questions for you, Anusha.
I see there's some comments in the chat. Are there questions? No questions.
I don't think there are any questions. This is rather intimidating company to be asking questions in, but I do want to congratulate you very heartily on your new book. And I hope that it will sell incredibly well, particularly for young people, where there's still a sense of wonder and understanding of where we came from and what happened in between.
Exactly.
So any questions for Anusha?
No questions. I can't believe
it. Well, the comments, thank you, Pete Kearns. Thank you very much. Fascinating and engaging. I'm hearing somebody.
Yeah, it's Sue, but Pete wants to ask a question, please.
Yes. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Pete.
Right. Yes, thank you. And it's a wonderful lecture and so enlightening. I would like maybe to, from a geologist's point of view, which I am, just maybe add an interesting dimension which I'm beginning to get interested in, and that's the evolution of birds along with, let's call it continental drift, the movement of our tectonic plates and our continents. And so, for example, you said all the modern birds that we now look at evolved mostly from the extinction event 65 million years ago, which, by the way, was a meteorite impact, a whole new and a different story we could talk about one day. So 65 million years ago, geologists are very clear on where the continents were moving. And let me just go back earlier than 65 million years ago. So 200 million years ago, all the continents that we are aware of today were all joined together in one supercontinent. It was called Pangaea. And that started to break up about 200 million years ago, and the Atlantic Ocean started to open in the north, and then a little bit later, 140 million years ago in the south, as North America and South America broke away from Africa and Europe. And of course, you were describing so well how bird groups were developing then. And then this extinction event occurred 65 million years ago and wiped out all those early bird-like dinosaurs. And then our new modern birds started to evolve quite quickly within 4 or 5 million years, according to one of your diagrams. So by 65 million years ago, South America and North America were well separated from Africa and most of Europe. India was quite separate, Australia was, China definitely was.
Mhm.
So all these modern birds we look at, and I'm only a beginner at birding, so I'm beginning to learn a few South African birds, but all the main bird groups seem to be distributed across the world. I mean, I'm talking in ignorance now, but for example, maybe robins you find in the robin family you find in North America. I don't know if I'm right there, but you find them in Europe and you find them in South Africa and maybe you find them elsewhere. So I think it would be a fascinating study to see how bird evolution took place as the continents were all now moving apart. And
Absolutely. Actually, I can tell you a bit more about that. In fact, I didn't actually include modern birds because, you know, modern birds, of course, the diversification of modern birds is quite different. And Linda, you might have heard one of my talks where I spoke about more modern birds, but this was more about deep time. So the fascinating thing about these the evolutionary history of birds is that, as I mentioned, the beginnings of the radiation of birds we know began in the Cretaceous, in the mid-Cretaceous. Okay, at the end of the Cretaceous, when the extinction event occurred, we know that they probably were members of those other lineages of modern birds around, but we just don't find them in the fossil record. But molecular evidence suggests that they were there. And in fact, when we look at the fossil evidence, we know that actually just last year there was one of these fossils, a beautiful fossil discovered that actually comes from Belgium and is the closest relative of the Yellowenceres. So basically the group that gives rise to chickens and the group that gives rise to ducks and geese. And so that's really quite interesting. And the other interesting thing is that when we look at the distribution of birds today, there's certainly a bigger diversity of birds in the southern continents. And this also seems to suggest that there may have been the diversification of birds from the southern continents. But the fossil record is telling us that there were certainly at one time a bigger diversification of birds. That in the northern hemisphere, there were birds that were present that are no longer found there today, but we find them in the fossil record. And I'm sorry, but I can't actually think of one just right now, but I know that they definitely exist. And there's certainly information that tells us that the modern biogeography of birds is also affected by many other factors. You know, so if you look at the radiation of the ratites, for example, you know, we know that in Madagascar, we had these Aepyornis, which were these giant elephant birds, okay? And they evolved from the same group to which kiwis actually belong. So the biogeography is really quite fascinating, actually.
Thank you, Anusuya. I'm just wondering, Peter, whether you oughtn't to be diving into Anusuya's couple of books that she's
well, I had a
published and start there.
I often wonder too about, I mean, we've been talking about it in bird groups for the last month or two, and that's, the name escapes me now, bird migration. As we're waiting for all the migratory birds to come back, it makes me think, well, when did these groups of birds start to migrate?
No, I honestly can't answer that. we have no clue. I mean, there's only 2 birds where their skulls are preserved and where there is a reconstruction of their brains. Only 2 birds. And, you know, even today, we don't understand exactly how birds are able to migrate and to understand their roots. So certainly in the fossil record, that's not understandable at this point.
No,
Great.
very complicated.
All right. Anusuya, I was just thinking about you and your wonderful privilege of being able to co-author the names of these different taxa, 6 different dinosaur taxa that you and I'm not sure who else was on your team. Yes, but goodness, imagine having those taxa that will go down in history as part of your legacy. So I'm extremely proud to have had you talk to the Rand Barbet Bird Club. Thank you so very much indeed. Thank you for giving of your time, and especially now in your sabbatical time. And I hope that your trip down to the Garden Route is amazing. So good night, everybody. I'm going to say good night, and thank you for joining us online. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.